Welcome to JS on Politics. I'm your host, Greg Borowski, and here's a quick look at what's ahead on today's show. A federal judge with local ties is on Donald Trump's short list for the U.S. Supreme Court, but there's a long road from here to November. Meanwhile, we take a look at whether everyone is getting along in the presidential race. Where does congressional candidate Frank Lasee live? We'll settle that as best we can. We'll also get an update on the voter ID lawsuit and take a look at a vacancy on the state Supreme Court. We'll get our winners and losers of the week. And, of course, we'll take some viewer questions, so please send those in. Let me introduce our panel for you. We've got Bill Glauber, one of our political reporters, who's been covering all sorts of things. I mean, in this case,
it's a busy year.
Diane Sykes mentioned in print, and then Mary Sircusa, another one of our political reporters. So let's set the background a little bit. So there is a vacancy on the Supreme Court. There is a nominee out there for the Supreme Court that the Republicans don't want to move on. You know, Trump is running. He doesn't have the nomination. To get his person in, he would need, presumably to keep the Republican control of the Senate. Is a little presumptuous here, Bill, or what's going on with his short list?
He would need to win, first of all, and so he's got a short list of 11. Of course, Obama has nominated Merrick Garland. The short list is a mix of conservative judges at both the state and federal level, and one of them is Diane Sykes, who is from Wisconsin, who was on the state Supreme Court, who used to work at the Milwaukee Journal many years ago, who's a Marquette University Law School graduate, and someone who Trump has mentioned previously back in February.
All right, but what is his, so part of the motivation here is he's been trying to assure conservatives of the type of person he would put on the court. So this is it's very early to put out a name in this case, but why is he doing it? And
he's doing it to assure conservatives that he's one of them. A lot of conservatives don't believe him, including Diane Sykes' former husband, Charlie Sykes, who tweeted very graciously about his former wife being on this short list, but is certainly no friend of Donald Trump.
Okay. So what do we know about Diane Sykes? And I guess I would call it maybe a short-ish list, because 11 people is kind of that's a long short list by short list standards. But what do we know about Diane Sykes in terms of, she's on the federal appeals court bench now, but what
She'd be the first former Milwaukee Journal Sentinel employee on the Supreme Court.
She'd also, actually, what would be interesting in all seriousness, you look at the Supreme Court now as it stands, you either had to go to Harvard or Yale, or in the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she went to Harvard and graduated from Columbia Law degree. So to have a Marquette University Law School grad on the Supreme Court, if it ever happens, would be an amazing thing. But she was a member of the Federalist Society. She is a very conventional conservative jurist. George W. Bush appointed her to the court in 2004. She was sent on her way, on her path, by Tommy Thompson, who appointed her from Milwaukee County Court over to the state Supreme Court. She ran a very gracious, level-headed race with Louis Butler for that seat when it was a permanent seat. And then, they went around the state debating together. You wouldn't even have that today. And she's a very conventional conservative, a little bit more to the right on the 7th District Court.
All right, before we shift to a broader look at the presidential race, let's just see how Donald Trump is doing this week. Do you have any sense of, sometimes you measure it by the headlines, right? He had a New York Times story about how his relationships and how he engages with women, including past employees. And then there's a story out today about all the lawsuits he's engaged with. Good headlines, good week, bad week. How's Donald Trump doing this week?
Kind of like every other week with Donald. It's like the best of times and worst of times. So, he, right after the New York Times story ran, then one of the main women quoted in the story, I guess the lead woman, came and was out on TV disputing the characterization of her relationship with him. So he quickly seized on that. So he was obviously trying to flip the headlines a bit. He did his Megyn Kelly interview on, I guess, Tuesday night and made nice with her. So, obviously he's had negative headlines this week, but he kind of does every week and seems to bounce back.
It doesn't seem to matter much in the
I covered him when he was in boxing and cycling. Nothing has changed, to be quite honest. And, also to be honest, the other big story this week is that the Hillary Clinton-Bernie Sanders race goes on and on and on, presumably sapping the Democrats a little bit that would help Trump. Trump, meanwhile, is trying to get the Republican Party on his side. They seem to be falling like dominoes one after the other. So probably all in all, it was a Trump week.
All right. Well, with that in mind, we'll go to this tape segment, which looks a little more closely at the presidential race and where things stand. We're joined now by Craig Gilbert, our Washington bureau chief, to give us an update and his take on what's happening in the presidential election. So, Craig, this week we had more results in some primaries on the Democratic side. Bernie Sanders won big in Oregon and a very close race in Kentucky. This thing seems to just keep grinding along. How much longer do you think before Hillary Clinton will apparently, obtain the nomination?
Well, I think at this point, we're looking at California, which isn't too far away, on June 6th. And, the math hasn't changed, obviously. I mean, he's still almost impossible for him to catch her in the delegate count. He's still appealing to superdelegates, but not hearing a lot back from them. I mean, the real drama on the Democratic side is the state of the party, the solidarity and unity and disunity. We're seeing the chaos we saw in Nevada over a controversial state convention and a fight over delegates there. A lot of uproar from Sanders delegates and a lot of reaction from Democratic Party people against that. So suddenly the Democratic Party is looking pretty fragmented too, and that's going to be a big task for Hillary Clinton, assuming she is the nominee, to try to amend those fences.
There's the same sort of dynamic as 8 years ago when she was running against Barack Obama, and that Obama was, sort of predetermined to get there based on how it's set up. But I mean, if this happened 8 years ago, wouldn't the Hillary Clinton folks be saying, look, we're winning all these primaries, we've got the momentum, we're the better candidate?
Yeah, in fact, she said some of the same things that Bernie Sanders is saying. The shoe's on the other foot now. I mean, it did happen 8 years ago. It was fragmented. They did end up coming together, and so there's good reason and good precedent for thinking that can happen again. One difference, though, is that in some ways the political lines are even sharper than they were 8 years ago. When you look at kind of the gender gap, the age gap, some of the ideological gaps, some of these dividing lines within the Democratic Party are actually a little bit sharper than they were in 2008. So I think that introduces kind of a new dynamic and a new challenge for the Democrats in putting that behind them again.
All right, well, let's look on the other side of the equation, the Republicans and the party unity there, where there's been obviously lots of struggles with Donald Trump. You wrote this week about Reed Ribble, the congressman from the Green Bay area, who says he will not vote for Donald Trump in the fall no matter what. I mean, how is the party unity going on that side from your perspective? It's
really a work in progress. I mean, it's hard to know whether to be more surprised that Paul Ryan hasn't endorsed his party's presumptive nominee, or that he might endorse him. And the same with a lot of these lawmakers who are Trump critics who are now behind him. You did have, I thought, what was a really interesting spectacle when the state party gathered in their convention on Saturday. And while other members of Congress from Wisconsin are getting behind Donald Trump, the man who actually chaired the convention, Reed Ribble, is a never Trump guy and says he won't even vote for Trump in the fall. And yet he wasn't getting a lot of pushback at the convention. He was very warmly received. I mean, that just in a nutshell kind of captures some of these contradictions and some of the tensions that people in the party are wrestling with and have been wrestling with for months.
All right, well, at some point in the near future, Donald Trump is going to need to identify and name a running mate, so he'll need somebody who's really behind him, and I know there's some who are with him in the party, but what are some of the pitfalls or thoughts you think people would go through evaluating that as an option? Because it's a different choice, I would imagine, than when Paul Ryan 4 years ago said yes to Mitt Romney.
Absolutely, and sort of in conventional terms, you can imagine the logic being picking somebody who is a more conventional candidate to kind of balance out the X factor of Donald Trump, somebody who maybe knows Washington. On the other hand, Donald Trump is such an unconventional candidate, and he's such a lightning rod that it's also kind of hard to imagine his running mate really having a lot of impact and influencing people. I mean, if you have big reservations about Donald Trump, are you going to be persuaded by the person that he chooses as his running mate? And if Donald Trump comes to the same conclusion, he may just want to double down on what's unconventional about his candidacy and go in the other direction. It's very unpredictable.
Yeah, but what about the calculation for the person who would be being asked to be on the ticket? Is that different in terms of thinking, well, does he really have a chance, or is it a step
up
I think potentially
it's
career-wise?
It's different in two respects. One is just the how unpredictable his candidacy is and volatile it is, and not knowing whether you're going to win, lose narrowly, or get blown out. That's one thought and one consideration. And the other is whoever that candidate is will be tied at the hip with Donald Trump in a way that that just merely endorsing him or saying you're supportive of the nominee, it'll go way beyond that, and it will kind of help define that person's career, and that may be a concern for certain kinds of Republicans as well.
All right. Well, never a dull moment or a dull week on the presidential campaign. We'll be back to talk more about what's happening next week with you, Craig. So thank you very much.
See you then.
All right, we're back live and joined now by Dan Bice, our Watchdog columnist. Dan, we want to talk about one of your stories here from this week on Senator Frank Lasee, who's a state senator, a congressional candidate, and a Airbnb entrepreneur, I guess. But tell us about that story.
One of my favorite guys to write about. There's a competitive race, a congressional race. Reed Ribbles decided not to run again. There are two main Republicans who are running. Mike Gallagher, who's a former Marine, and he worked on Scott Walker's presidential campaign, and he's running against Frank Lasee, a long-standing Republican legislator, was in Assembly and then went to the Senate. And on the other side, Tom Nelson is the Democrat, and he'll be a tough candidate against those two. I was writing about Frank Lasee. Frank has this odd situation where he has his apartment in De Pere, but his wife and most of his family lives in Racine. His wife is a real estate agent. She owns a house down there. Nice house. His apartment, it's a small house. And several people sent in notes to us saying, hey, did you know you could rent his apartment through Airbnb? So we tried to do that. And we got through the process.
It came through in your expense report? Is there something I should be worried about?
There are lots of things to it. One, it's not in his district as a senator. Racine is not. And then secondly, he's claimed mileage back and forth from De Pere over the last year and a half. I just looked at the last year and a half, which has resulted in $9,000 for him. It's much shorter to go to Racine and back and forth that way. And he has said on the record that he actually spends time in Racine, but he's mainly in De Pere. So we wanted to see if you're actually living in a house, it's odd to have people rent it, because it was the entire apartment that you could rent. It was $210 a night to stay there. He had all the pictures on there. And so we tried to rent it, and it became an incredibly elaborate process. His wife was the agent for the thing. There are usually, when you rent something through Airbnb, a few questions you have to go through, but then it got, why are you doing this? Who do you work for? What's your purpose for your meeting? How many days are you going to be here? Da, 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 da. And eventually, I think they realized the person was with the Journal-Sentinel and said, no, you can't do it. And then shortly after that, the entire thing came down from Airbnb. I talked to Frank. Frank said, yes, we did this, but we only did it for Packers weekends. But when we were trying to rent it, there was no mention of this was just for Packers weekend. All of the dates were open, and there was no discussion about whether the apartment was available or not. It was all about why we were going there and who we worked for.
The bigger concern, I guess, from the electoral or the voters would be is he truly living in the district, or isn't he? And were you able to kind of settle that, or is that still an open question of how much time he spends? I
don't think we settled it necessarily. I mean, there's two issues. There's one, as a senator, you do have to live in your district. There's an odd thing, if you're in Congress, you just have to live in the state. But it is an issue of your connection to the district and so forth. And, if he's in Racine, that's a much tougher congressional race. That's against Paul Ryan, and he would never run that race. I don't think we settled it, but I think it is pretty clear that that it is very odd, if he is living mainly in De Pere, that he had his place available for anybody to rent at any time through Airbnb.
Yeah, so Mary, you've covered Frank Lasee in the Senate and legislature for years. Tell us a little bit about how he's viewed there and among his colleagues and others.
He's very unapologetically conservative, I would say. He did quite a bit of legislation this past session, strengthening landlord rights that were pretty controversial. He's clashed frequently with assembly leaders like Robin Boss over issues. There was kind of a battle over the budget of who would vote on it first, the Assembly or Senate. The Senate ended up voting first, and it turned out Senator Lasee had a trip planned to Mexico on vacation with his family and didn't want to have to reschedule that. He said that wasn't the reason that they didn't trust.
He got some national attention for trying to say that teachers should be armed and allowed to carry guns into the classroom and so forth, which he, again, was unapologetic for. Got a lot of, negative attention. He tends to draw sort of attention for some of his personal things. I once wrote a story about him sending a letter to the Brown Deer High School saying that he had heard kids were having sex in the hallways, and there was no proof of this, but he heard this and he just sent the letter and so forth. So and stood by the letter after he sent it. So it's sort of a quirky senator, but he is, he took my call, he talked, it went along okay until I started pressing a lot of questions about where exactly they lived, and then eventually he hung up.
All right, well, we'll leave that discussion there and turn now to a tape segment that looks at the voter ID case at the trial level. We're joined now by Patrick Miley from our Madison Bureau to talk about an ongoing trial involving the voter ID lawsuit. Patrick, you've been covering that. Tell us a little bit about what's being challenged here, because some people say, like, that law is in effect. I thought this was resolved. What's at issue right now?
So, yeah, this is at least the 5th lawsuit over voter ID that I'm aware of. The previous lawsuits have found that the law is constitutional, and so they're not looking here to fully overturn the law. It would be on things more like should additional IDs be available? There's only a certain types of IDs like driver's licenses or state-issued IDs that can be used. This perhaps, if the plaintiffs win, could broaden the types of IDs. And also what they've really focused on in the early testimony is people who don't have birth certificates or have birth certificates that don't match their names on their Social Security cards. Those people can have some great difficulties in getting the free IDs that the state offers through the voter ID law. And so the question is, should there be a more streamlined process or an easier way for those people to get IDs if they're otherwise eligible to vote?
What have we learned so far from the testimony? I know on the initial day there was a lot of attention to the comments about lawmakers being giddy about passing the law and so forth. Does that really go to the point here in the lawsuit, or is that just more of political interest?
Well, that's it's unclear how much effect that will have. The state was saying that all of that was hearsay and shouldn't be entered in, and it's a little unclear how much attention the judge will give that. But it speaks to the broader theme that the plaintiffs are charging, which is that the voter ID law and other recent changes to voting laws were intentionally passed to to diminish the turnout of Democrats or make it harder for minorities, young people, elderly people who might be inclined to vote for Democrats to vote. And so they were using that as evidence that it was an intent to suppress the vote. This lawsuit, it should be noted, is much broader than just looking at the voter ID law. In the last 5 years, there have been 2 laws passed that limit early voting. There have been changes made to where election observers can stand when they watch the voting process. They can be closer to the tables now. We've eliminated straight ticket voting. So the groups that have brought this lawsuit are arguing that all of those things taken together have hurt the Democrats' ability to get to the polls.
All right. And what is the timetable we're looking at here, both in terms of when the testimony and the trial would finish or when there might be a ruling or determination on it?
It's a very long trial. It started on Monday. It's scheduled to go 9 days. It does appear to be moving at a nice, slow, plodding judicial pace. So, they may make the full 9 days. We don't know how quickly the judge would issue a ruling. It's before Judge James Peterson. He's a federal judge in Madison. He has not been on the bench for a long time, but has developed a reputation of dealing with cases pretty expeditiously. So, and I think he's going to be keeping in mind that these questions are looming out there as we have a presidential election coming up. So I would expect him to rule, within a matter of weeks. And I think it's very likely that whoever wins or loses will appeal to the 7th Circuit in Chicago.
All right, let's talk finally about another court ruling in a totally separate case. This was Wednesday from the state Supreme Court on some challenges to administrative rule changes that Scott Walker and the Republicans put through, specifically affecting, in this case, Tony Evers, the superintendent of public instruction. Tell us just a little bit about what the significance of that ruling is.
Yeah, it's a big decision, though. Administrative rules is a pretty dry area of the law. Administrative rules implement state laws. They have more details than state laws, and they carry the force of law. So one of the first things Governor Walker did when he took office was change that process working with the legislature, and it gave the governor more oversight of those rules. He could block them on the front end and block them on the back end. So he had veto authority over these rules. There was a lawsuit over Tony Evers, who's independently elected, and saying that the governor shouldn't be able to have that kind of say in what the rules are for state schools. The plaintiffs won at every case and have blocked that law 4-3 ruling from the state Supreme Court. The plaintiffs won at every level. They won in Dane County Circuit Court. They won before the appeals court, and then they narrowly won here before the Supreme Court.
All right, so that's where we will leave our discussion today as Patrick continues to earn credits for his law degree through his coverage of these cases in Madison. So thanks, Patrick, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, we're back, and we'll stick with the state Supreme Court for a little bit here because they have an important appointment coming up from Governor Walker. Justice David Prosser is stepping down at the end of July. He doesn't have a short list yet like Donald Trump, but what are you looking for, Dan, in terms of that selection from the governor?
Well, there are three names who are being discussed a great deal. I mean, there are more people who are doing it. One is Mark Gundrum, appeals court judge, Brian Hagedorn, appeals court judge, and Judge Doro, Waukesha County. All very conservative, very much more conservative than Prosser. And Patrick was just talking about the decision on the Tony Evers case. And, in that case, you have Prosser, who's very much a moderate on it, and comes with Gableman, and they join with the two liberals. I don't think you'd see that with any one of these three individuals who are being considered.
Yeah, and how much significance is there to this appointment in terms of the balance on the court and in this case, maybe it would have made a difference, but just generally speaking, it's still a conservative court. He falls into that block.
Right. I think anybody that Governor Walker picks is going to strengthen the conservative majority on the court and probably move it to more conservative, unless Walker decides he wants to wait until the next governor takes over, but I doubt that's going to happen.
No, that's probably not going to happen.
Just a year or two ago, there was this discussion about, was it a 4-3 or a 5-2 or what exactly the balance is? I think after this appointment, it's going to be a solid 6-2. A solid 5-2 majority. You're going to have the four conservatives now, plus whoever's appointed, and then Abramson and Bradley isolated as the liberals on the left.
All right. Well, let's shift now to our winners and losers of the week. And Dan, we'll start with your winner.
Well, mine's obvious. We were just talking about Tony Evers. I thought he was going to lose this case, and I think a lot of people thought he would, but he ends up edging out and getting a 4-3 decision, which is a big and important decision for him in terms of serving as an independent voice, because he's one of the few liberals in state government right now, someone who will oppose Scott Walker on education issues.
All right, and Mary, let's get your winner from this past week.
I would say Diane Sykes. She's getting national attention. This isn't the first time Trump has dropped her name as a possible Supreme Court justice, but certainly kind of formalized now that she's on the short list. So I think that she's probably getting talked about far more around the country than she typically does.
Right, and she gives hope for all of us journalists that someday we too could be on the Supreme Court short list.
I think we have to go to law school first.
Well, it's a minor detail.
When is Marquette accepting applications?
And you're a Marquette guy, right?
I'm a Marquette guy.
So more hope for you than for us.
Yeah, that's true. And Mary, let's go to your loser of the week.
I would say also Diane Sykes. It's kind of an awkward position for a Wisconsin conservative because obviously Donald Trump did not win here. He was not overwhelmingly popular here. Her ex-husband was obviously a vocal member of the Never Trump movement.
Still is.
Yes, was and is currently. So he was gracious about Diane being on the short list in his tweet and his public comments. But I don't know that too many Wisconsin conservatives really want to be linked too closely with Donald Trump at this point. I think they're still kind of trying to figure out what they think about him.
Yeah, it's sort of, if it were to come to pass, it gives an awful long period for people to vet her record and to set up all the anti-appointment stuff that you would see. So it's not necessarily a good
Start reading her what she published, any published writings at Marquette, all kinds of things. So yes, I think that
read her old newspaper articles. You can find them in our library.
Just like Justice Bradley.
All right, and Dan, let's get your loser of the week.
Well, she just mentioned Wisconsin Republicans and their stance on Trump. With the three main Republicans here, Scott Walker, Paul Ryan, and Reince Priebus, you have Ryan, who's taken this wait-and-see position. You have Walker, who's done this reluctant endorsement. Then you have Reince Priebus, the head of the Republican Party. He's my loser of the week because he's got to be all in. As head of the Republican Party, he becomes the face of the establishment speaking out in favor of Trump. And this past weekend, he had to do that. He had a very difficult time responding to questions about all of the issues from the past week, and I'm assuming this is going to go forward. His two main arguments were, one, no one cares about these issues, which somebody cares because he has to answer questions about them, and 2, Hillary's worse. That's right now his 2 strategies. Right. It's a difficult one. He's going to come under a lot of criticism because it's a thankless job trying to defend whatever the Donald has done the past week.
And part of the criticism was he had said something to the effect of that no one cares about this, and the way Donald Trump was engaging with women, that particular story. And that,
right. And so, I think he's taken these 2 tactics, but they don't work on some issues, particularly when 50% or 51% of the voting population is female. Women do care about his attitude towards women. The question is, I think what he meant to say was no one cared about this particular story, this New York Times story, which had its shortcomings, but it came across as saying that he didn't care how Donald Trump dealt with women.
And in the lead up to the primary here, I was driving all over the state talking to a lot of voters and a lot of conservative voters because I was covering Ted Cruz events or Donald Trump events. And especially, obviously a lot of the Wisconsin conservative women, one of their concerns about Donald Trump was his treatment of women. So I think that if they're trying to reach out to women voters, you don't want to send a message that we don't care how
just look at every
women
poll and you see his negatives are higher with women than they are with
that's
men.
a good spot to go to our questions because there's one that's right on point here. This is from Just Askin, who says, what will it take for Donald Trump to get a fair shake with the media? It's not like the Clintons didn't have all sorts of problems with women. I'm thinking they're referring probably to Bill Clinton in particular. But
and it's not like Bill Clinton didn't have media coverage about his women issues. I mean, obviously Hillary Clinton had to give that famous 60 Minutes appearance during the election in which she talked about standing by her man and so forth. But I do think the issue, the scrutiny of Donald Trump has been a little more intense on the women issue than it was for Clinton in the lead up to the election, because that was a National Enquirer story that was done there. To get a fair shake with the media, I mean, the fact is, Donald Trump engages and loves the attention from the media. First, there's questions about whether he's the one who released the tape of him faking like he was his own spokesman. It's not clear who released that tape. And then secondly, on this story, it's interesting that he's calling the production room of CNN to make sure that they saw an interview on another station before they do any coverage of these issues. There's no one who cares more about the media and is engaging the media more than Donald Trump, despite all of his talk about how he's not getting a fair shake.
And Governor Walker and a lot of the other Republican contenders complained about how it was hard to get, like he was sucking up all the oxygen. It was hard to get media attention because Donald Trump was kind of...
Well, somebody put a dollar figure on how much it would cost for him to pay for the sort of free media that he got during the primary, and it's more than $1 billion. So I think though much of the media attention is critical, I think he's benefited a great deal from the free media attention.
All right. In our world here, a lot of these questions are Trump directly or indirectly. This is from Please Help, and I'm going to throw this one to you, Mary. It says, what can we do to stop the design for the new arena? It reminds me of a ski slope, and others have compared it to Donald Trump's hair. But on the ski slope...
You're the one bringing in Trump now.
Yeah.
It brought it to mind. But it's past the committee, right? So is there really much to be done to change the design at this point, or is that a pretty well...
I would be pretty surprised if there are major changes to the arena design at this point. We've pretty much been told that there won't be major changes, that they'll be tinkering around the edges and landscaping changes. But please help. Sorry, please. Yeah. I don't think, I'd be very surprised if there are major changes, and I think it would have to be a structural crisis or something.
All right, and we'll just squeeze in this one from the conductor who says, when does Ron Johnson jump on the Sykes train? So this isn't the Trump train, this is the Sykes train. Would he be supportive of Diane Sykes?
Sure, he'll be supportive. The issue is he on the Trump train or not? Because he had earlier talked very favorably about him, talking about the Donald and the Ronald running together. But now he's trying to split hairs, saying he supports Trump, but he doesn't endorse him. And if you understand that, you're probably ahead of most voters. So,
all right, we'll get the dictionary out and come back for you guys next week, all of our favorite viewers here. So please join us again next week at the same time, and thanks for joining us today.